So we have, you'll recognize from the film, Sam Braverman here, the attorney. And a card. Cards for everybody. Everybody gets a card. So we won't be talking about the movie that much because this is not about the movie making, but we'll be talking about the case, if that's okay with everybody. Just remarkable situation. And while I can understand the laughter that I heard a couple of times, so there's some characters and some interesting things and the really sad parts that are laughter, but I just couldn't even laugh because it's just too horrifying. And the first thing that strikes me of a million things that strike me is in all the press conferences and all the things that were said in the press conferences that we now know to be completely untrue, radicalized in prison and contacted in prison when they didn't even know each other in prison. So those things that, how many of those things are we hearing in press conferences that are completely manufactured and made up?
And that we hear every day.
Exactly.
So it is one of those classics from everything that you've studied in history where you know the manipulation of the media that is done by whoever has access to the media, whether it's the government or the media itself or individuals or corporations. And they use that for the tool that satisfies their purposes and not ours, that the media gets co-opted. And so what should be the honest fourth estate that gives us the examination of the government becomes the tool of the government. You know, when they sat there, the part of the movie that I find the worst is that picture of everybody on the City Hall steps.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the one that makes me most angry. More angry than the case, because sadly, this is one of hundreds of cases or thousands of cases of an injustice that happens every day around the country. So it's an example of that, which is terrible. But that our government so betrayed their duty to us, and that they stand there, and that Schumer makes that statement on the stage, and that the FBI assistant director makes that statement on the stage, that's the one that infuriates me more, because it means that everything else I trust, I shouldn't trust.
Right, exactly, and just lie after lie after lie. I mean, the media even makes an attempt to ask the question, would they have done this if the FBI hadn't set them up to do it? And Schumer says, well, we infiltrated them a year ago. Well, you didn't infiltrate them, you created them over the course of a year.
During that time period, there's a period of 3 months where when Hussein disappeared, I'm sorry, when James Cromley disappears, he's actually in his house during this time period. And the FBI knows that because they've staked out his house. So they know he hasn't left. So they knock on the door and his wife says he's not here, he's gone out of town. But they know he's there. He's on the other side of the door. They call him on the phone and they say, James, where are you? He says, oh, I'm out of town. But their GPS tells them that he's in the next room. They know this. And so he's hiding from them. They keep calling him again and again and again and again. And then finally, it's slightly abbreviated here in the movie, but he says, fine, I'll meet with you. And it is the perfect example of overcoming his will against us.
It's just
the definition of entrapment.
Incessant pressure, which is just unbelievable. But you, just by the numbers, you take it down, and okay, hatched in a mosque, not hatched in a mosque, but the targeting of Muslims, like the identifying of Muslims as the enemy. This is the hotbed of, and 0 cases coming out of mosques.
Right. Using
targeting the poor. Targeting African Americans, taking that community, going to that community specifically, and offering $250,000, which, as a guy says, is change your life money. $5,000 is change your life money in Newburgh.
Yeah, for Laguerre Payen, who doesn't eat, I mean, literally doesn't eat. So you see film after film, it's about 50 hours of videotape, and most of them he's eating. And at some point there's a dispute. He says, I'm tired of chicken. And Cromedy says, that's halal chicken. You'll eat that chicken. He goes, well, I'm tired of chicken. But that's all he gets because that's what they keep bringing him, chicken from the place across the street. Literally, I mean, the joke is that, you can convert anybody if you feed them.
You're right.
So they've converted them to terrorists by feeding them.
Well, they converted them only by the fact that they paid them. It's like, this is for money. This is a job for money. It's nothing to do with jihad. It's nothing to do with anything except getting some money.
They don't know anything about it.
And the case was made that they wanted to get over on the informant, and so they didn't even turn on the bomb. And it's like, and what David says is I find him more credible than anybody else. And he says, look, I don't want to hurt anybody. He says, what if somebody's on the plane? What if somebody's cleaning the plane? What if another poor person like me is assigned to clean that plane? I don't want to hurt them.
They think farther ahead on that topic than any other.
And
Laguerre at one point says, well, they said we're going to go to Florida. He says, I can't go to Florida. I don't have a passport.
It's just
he can't read.
So
he can't read anything. So
and
the idea that he could read the Quran and derive from that a theory
Well,
It's impossible.
And going across state lines, they have to go across state lines to have the federal crime.
Right.
They have to have the Stinger missile mentioned, but it's only mentioned by the informant, and that's for the minimum sentence. It's to make it terrorism and to show the missile in court. I mean, all this just by the numbers. Let me ask you a couple of quick technical questions. Are you representing just Cromartie? You represent all four of them?
I just represented Laguerre-Pia, and he was my client.
Okay.
We did the appeals. It went to the Second Circuit Court of Appeal, which is our first appeals court, and they all three judges ruled against all four defendants. Whereas one judge ruled in favor of Cromartie that he was entrapped, but said that the other three were not entrapped, despite the fact that there was no evidence that they actually had a plan, did this before, or readily accepted, because there's no tape of them accepting.
Right.
They just come fully formed onto the set.
Well,
And
they
then
were
the
brought in by Cromartie anyway.
And then that's derivative entrapment, that the agent of the government has entrapped them, and then the Supreme Court rejected the case. They did, which was enormously disappointing. And so they're done.
So there's no recourse at this point.
There's no recourse at this point. They get to do a writ of habeas corpus. Laguerre doesn't even file a writ of habeas corpus.
Uh-huh.
So,
Well, it is mind-boggling. And you got on the case because of being asked by a judge to take it on a public defender?
yeah, Judge Chambers called up one day and said, "Can you come down to court?" I said, "What's the case about?" They said, "Well, I can't tell you." So I said, "Well, is this going to be interesting?" They said, "Oh, yes, come down tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. So I come down at 10 o'clock, and Judge McMahon says, "All right, it's a terrorism case. We're going to try the case in 4 months." I said, "I'm busy in 4 months." She said, "No, you're not." And that was it. That was my introduction to the case. That's how I got on the case.
So it wasn't that they were asked if they couldn't afford a defendant,
Well, they did that early on, but they couldn't afford anything.
Right.
So they got essentially assigned a public defender and Judge, and then there's private attorneys who do this kind of work, and Judge McMahon called me up and said, "Can you take it?"
Okay, so if there's no recourse for them, is there anything because of, towards the end of the film, we see other situations which could be as bad, or they could lend themselves to the same kind of entrapment and manufactured terrorism? Is there any movement based on what's going on in this film to try and get at this situation?
I think there is. I think there's a couple of good places to do that. The first one, of course, is to be skeptical of what you read. That if you make yourself less vulnerable to the hysteria of the media, the less vulnerable to the hysteria-inducing comments of the government.
The fear-mongering,
The
basically.
fear-mongering. If you make yourself less vulnerable to that, that's the best thing you can do. As they always say, question everything. There's no reason not to. You're not a servant of the government. The government's a servant of yours, so you should be questioning what your servant is doing. So the next thing you should do is you should be asking people who are your government, why are they doing what they're doing? Why do they spend the money the way they spend it? How do they choose to prosecute cases? When there is movement afoot to change the way we prosecute a case, get involved in something do something like that. Write a letter. There's actually a good idea you should write to your representative and say, "I don't approve of this behavior."
Yeah.
That's the kind of things and we should be electing people that choose that method, not the method that promotes this kind of terrorism by the government. And if you watch the debates, you see nothing but that sort of craziness.
So if anybody has a question, okay, right here.
Yeah. What did the judges give as reasons for turning the appeal, or for the decisions on the appeal?
The Second Circuit Court of Appeals said that the four defendants had done this event. So the government's original argument was that they committed the crime, and therefore you knew that they were therefore willing to commit the crime, which of course ignores the whole idea of entrapment. You can't actually raise entrapment if you haven't done the crime. If you haven't done the crime, you're not guilty of anything. So it turned the argument on its head. The Second Circuit said, essentially, they did do it, therefore they were not entrapped, which of course is absurd. The Supreme Court, because of who they are, don't have to say anything. You just get a letter that says, "Dear Mr. Braverman, your petition for certiorari has been denied." And that in one sentence, it's over.
Up here.
I'm wondering about the original trial, which was before a jury, I believe.
Yes.
How in God's name could a jury look at what we just saw and not conclude that there was entrapment? Was the prosecution heavy on excluding the videotapes and all that?
We had an interesting experience because we started the trial in June of 2010. And on the day before, we'd already picked a jury, but we had not started anything. And the government turned over a large trove of documents, one of which was a document that said, by Fuller, who was the agent who had the responsibility of this informant, he was asked by Stewart Air Force Base, should I be afraid if I see these people? And Fuller said, no, there's nothing to be afraid of. They can't do anything without us. That caused us to get a mistrial, and then we went for another 2 months. We surveyed a total of 1,000 potential jurors. And one juror said the most perfect thing. She wrote in her questionnaire, I understand and I would accept the law of entrapment, but I don't know that I could live with myself if I was wrong. And I think ultimately, in the end, that's the greatest impediment we ever had. That we had 12 jurors who accepted the idea, they accepted the law, they understood it, they debated for 6 days, back and forth about this. And in fact, they sent us a note at one point that says, do we have to be unanimous as to the reason they're not guilty or just that they're not guilty? I thought we were there. And then we lost.
Just a quick question before we take others. The former FBI agent, Mike German, is his name, and then the former executive director or whatever he was,
Right.
the other FBI guy, he's also former.
Yes.
Are they former because of this case?
No,
or
not at
other
all.
things to do?
Both of them had moved on for own reasons, but because they were free from government employment, they were therefore free to speak their mind. I'm sure there are people who have a countervailing opinion from the government's position, but because they still own the government, they refuse to do it. I know the U.S. attorneys well. One of them I still see on a somewhat regular basis. Suzanne Brody, who was the lead lawyer for Ante Williams, is still in the same building as one of the government lawyers. And every time she sees him, she gets on the elevator and she just starts screaming at him. 5 years later, she still screams at him. And he has to get off the elevator. And he says, well, I was on the elevator first. She said, this is my elevator, get off. And he literally gets off the elevator because she can't even see him.
No.
The anger runs so deep.
I'm not surprised. More questions, right here.
It's amazing to me, I mean, you can't get the government and all its agencies to work in concert on a minor thing. Here you have something that really had a lot of leaks in it. I mean, the informant wasn't the best informant you could have. And it kind of like trudged along, and you had New York City Police, you had the different groups within the government, Homeland Security, FBI, all of these things working for a common purpose of not good. And not one of them, I mean, the New York City Police Commissioner, let's say, in reviewing the data, he's a seasoned cop, he would say, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. Or the senator of the state of New York saying, wait a minute, we're being led here by some other ulterior thing. There's some script being played out. And nobody really raised any question, and they just shoved it all along. And to me, that's the most disgusting thing that you can have. And to go through the Supreme Court and not allow you your day in court to present the data of entrapment and all the other issues that happen. It's another case of if you're impoverished in this country, you better really have your antennas up, because there are people out there that you're going to be, the idea of not eating is the least of the problems. You're going to be just used as fodder for some political thing that we're not really aware of.
It's absolutely true. And the entrapment idea works in lots of different contexts. So for instance, they'll go to a low-level street dealer and they say, could you sell me a gram of cocaine? And the guy says, sure. They say, by the way, could you sell me a kilogram? And the guy says, well, I couldn't get you a kilogram. He said, but if you could, would you do it? Oh, absolutely. Then they charge him with conspiring to sell a kilogram, which takes the minimum for, no time to 5 years. So this happens repeatedly in a lot of different contexts. But to your point, and then coming back to your point in some sense, this is confirmation bias as well. So that the person's there, they see these people who are incompetent, but they also hear him say, I want to do something to strike back at America. That's enough to get them over all the other humps. That's enough to get them through all the other parts. And the concept of being the one who pulls the plug on this and says, we're not going forward, if then they did do something, that guy never gets promoted again. That juror can't live with herself. And so the process moves forward, and everybody always says, well, somebody else will solve the problem. So somebody at a higher level will pull the plug on this. The jury will save us from this. The prosecutors do. The prosecutors thought the judge would save them. The judge thought the Second Circuit would save her. The Second Circuit says, well, maybe the Supreme Court will save her. And in the end, nobody saved anybody.
So everybody loses.
Everybody
Yeah,
loses.
and to your point also, you say the sad part is that they're not asking the questions. When they're presented with this, they're not asking the questions. But as it's said in the film, it's not a question of not asking the questions. They're scripted to go along with it because they're not going to get reelected. If they question, oh, well, not all Muslims are jihadists. Well, you're not going to get reelected because the general public is saying, well, they must be. They're Muslims. They must be Muslims. They must be jihadists.
Right, and this all takes place 5 years ago.
Exactly.
The temperature on this has only gone up.
Well, and it's getting worse.
Much
I mean,
worse.
The debates, it's ridiculous. But at any rate, other questions? We're going to wrap it up in a second. But any other questions in the House?
Front row.
Right here?
Aren't they afraid of, by their actions, of creating more terrorists? Because if they did something like that to me when I got out of prison, I definitely might think about this.
Absolutely.
Some payback.
Yeah, Mike German, who I've done this presentations before, who's the agent, the really good-looking blonde guy in the movie. In life, he's even more impressive. He's a great guy. His whole point is that it takes our eye off the real ball. That's the point he makes in the movie. He makes it repeatedly when he's doing it. The second thing is exactly to your point, a point that he makes regularly is that, and I think one of the imams also makes the point as well, we could deal with these people at the much earlier stage, just like you can deal with juveniles much easier than you can deal with adults, and you can solve problems before they become large. When you've damaged a community as big as the Muslim community, as big as the African American community, as big as the poorest of the poor, why would you not expect to reap from that community what you've sowed?
Sure. That's what the aunt says. The aunt becomes radicalized and says the government is a terrorist.
Exactly. She's magnificent. In real life, she's the favorite.
No, just incredibly intelligent. Okay, one more question.
I just wondered if her point of coming to black communities was repeated over and over across the country in parallel cases, whether that is true that the black community is targeted.
Well, it's targeted in many ways, substantially. Part of the Newburgh targeting is not African Americans per se, but targeting the poor. You also, so for instance, the Shahid Hussein went to, there's another mosque across the Hudson River in a town called Wappingers Falls, and that mosque has a lot more money. So when Shahid Hussein went there first, he was literally tossed out of that mosque. And a lot of professionals there, they are reading the same Quran. Toss him out of the mosque. So when he comes to this mosque, nobody inside the mosque talks to him. But James Cromedy, who's outside the mosque, does. James Cromedy's not a regular attendee at that mosque at all. He's a wanderer. He's a poor person, an itinerant just wandering around. And he's the person. So trolling down the food chain, Shahid Hussein got down to the person that he could finally make a connection with. And then they went even farther down the food chain to get the rest of the people. They work that way in other different communities for different crimes and for different opportunities. So that same community gets targeted again and again in different ways depending on what the motivation is and who you're looking to corrupt.
Well, it's a phenomenal passage towards radicalizing the unknowing American public who buys into this. And one of the last statements is so true. I mean, without him coming into this community, those guys are standing on the corner smoking weed and drinking beers and looking for work or looking for somebody else to give them some money. And yeah, sure, they're probably criminals, but they're not adept enough at being criminals to do anything more than what they're doing.
And they'll be prosecuted for selling marijuana and standing on street corners.
Exactly. So,
Anyway.
which makes sense. Well, thank you very, very
Thank you,
much
sir.
for being part of this.
Pleasure.
And
Pleasure.